Greetings. I am Dr. Graciela Canedo Livingston, Provost at Nebraska Wesleyan University. I want to welcome you to this year's presentation of Spooky Evenings. We here at Nebraska Wesleyan are excited and proud of this event that brings together scholars, artists, authors, and filmmakers to discuss the topic of horror in its various manifestations across the arts and the humanities. Professor Juan Jose Castaño Marquez and Dr. Matthew Jarvis have been working tirelessly to bring you the best scholarship in the field of horror through this unparalleled digital humanities event. I would like to acknowledge the generous support from the Nebraska Arts Council, Humanities Nebraska, and the Nebraska Cultural Endowment that helps make quality programming like Spooky Evenings possible. Again, welcome and enjoy this presentation of Spooky Evenings.
Tonight on Spooky Evenings, Dr. Cristina Santos of Brock University presents a talk entitled Myth, Murder, and Monstrosity, Motherhoods in Mexican Cultural Imaginary.
And we're live.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my guest, Dr. Cristina Santos.
Hello.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for the invitation. It was an interesting invitation I could not say no to.
Well, sounds like the first Godfather. So you're going to talk to us tonight about myth, murder, and monstrosity, motherhood in Mexican cultural imaginary.
Yes, indeed. So just let me try and share my screen and see how that works.
Sounds good.
And let me know if we're okay.
We are great.
Wonderful. So just a little background on my research on monstrosity and motherhoods, specifically for Mexico. So back in 2005, I was putting together an edited volume on monsters, and I had asked a Mexican colleague to give me a chapter on La Llorona. And you know, you kind of had to check in with her a few times. And finally, the third time she said, I can't do it. I'm like, why? You know, she's like, ever since you asked me to do it, La Llorona keeps coming into my life. It's a superstition. The more you think about La Llorona, she's going to appear. So I said, okay, fine. I'll just write it. So I wrote my first paper on La Llorona, my initial research. And I thought, oh, I'm just going to take a break, watch this new series that's launching tonight called Supernatural. And the pilot episode was The Lady in White, La Llorona. So I'm like, maybe she does have a point. So that was my first exposure to La Llorona, let's put it that way. So I think I'm going to be reading mostly, or otherwise I do go off on tangents. And I guess I'll go right into it right now. So in her book, The Monster Within, The Hidden Side of Motherhood, psychoanalyst Barbara Almond explores the idea of maternal ambivalence as the monster within. She takes an interdisciplinary approach, pulling from her own medical cases, personal experiences, and literary examples to discuss the dark side of womanhood, when mothering and or motherhood is not automatically self-fulfilling for the woman. Sociocultural conditions create what Paul Ricoeur might call a prefiguration and an idealization of the self-sacrificing mother figure that lives and dies for her children. But what happens when women are unwilling or unable to fulfill this unobtainable ideal of the perfect mother? By examining the Mexican figures of motherhood, such as Coatlicue, La Malinche, and the Virgin of Guadalupe, and La Llorona, one can see how restrictive sociocultural scripts have a psycho-emotional impact on the individual, and incite feelings of hopelessness, guilt, and self-hatred. The examination of these Mexican mother figures departs from the essential recognition of racial, social, and sexual prefiguratives that expect a certain code of behavior that solidifies a social condemnation of a woman who does not know her place, either in her family or social environment. As such, the monstrous mother figure is constructed within a dominantly patriarchal culture, privileging externalized definitions of the perfect and the imperfect or bad mother, without the option of just being a good enough mother. To what degree do sociocultural frameworks of idealized and idolized motherhoods impact the perception of the redemptive and destructive power of motherhood? The mother figures considered here are at times viewed as monstrous because they go against the expected nurturing and self-abnegating mother figure. She kills her children by drowning them. Yet other versions draw attention to her victimization at the hands of a patriarchal society because of her racial and or social inferiority, keeping in mind that she is not only the maligned mother figure, but also an orphan daughter, lover, or wife. Some of the prefiguratives of the monstrous mother archetype date back to the biblical figure of Rachel, who is inconsolable upon losing her children. In Greek mythology, we have Medea, who murdered her children after being abandoned by Jason. And even some vampiric figures, such as the Malaysian languisseur or the Greek Lamiae, who prey on other people's children because they have lost their own. Not to mention the biblical story of Lilith, who is said to have been Adam's first wife, but who left the Garden of Eden when she refused to let Adam control her. Nevertheless, for the sake of brevity today, I will be focusing specifically on the depiction of the Mexican mother figures of La Malinche, the Virgin of Guadalupe, and La Llorona, and their recovery by Chicana writers and artists. It is important to note that these mother figures have pre-colonial roots in the indigenous mythological figures of Coatlicue and her descendant, Cihuacuatl. Both warrior goddesses represented female power and strength, but also fertility of both the land and its people, and are depicted as malignant mother figures by the androcentric colonial Christian discourse. They are configured as bad women because, as stated by Alicia Gaspar de Alba in her book, Unframing the Bad Woman, they are, and I quote, confrontational to a patriarchal worldview, end of quote, and one that is ultimately punished for her non-compliance with abuse, torture, and rape. That is, and I quote, ritual destruction of the female body. The figuration of the goddess Coatlicue is part of Aztec mythohistory, as evidenced by the iconic statue of Coatlicue currently housed in the Museo Nacional de Antropología e Historia in Mexico City. After being miraculously impregnated by hummingbird feathers she held in her lap, Coatlicue's daughter, Coyolxauhqui, leads a revolt against her own mother because of the shame the pregnancy has brought to the family, and the threat of Coatlicue giving birth to the god of war. To protect his mother, the baby Huitzilopochtli emerges full grown and in battle gear and successfully defends his mother from the attempt on her life. The myth culminates with Huitzilopochtli decapitating and dismembering his sister, Coyolxauhqui, and throwing her body parts tumbling down the temple steps, an act that some critics, as Gaspar de Alba and Irene Lara, associate with the cultural disempowerment of women. That is, the myth as an androcentric perspective situates Coatlicue and Coyolxauhqui as the weak women to be either saved or dominated by a man, and in this case, the warrior god Huitzilopochtli. Nevertheless, as Cecilia F. Klein points out in New Interpretations of the Aztec statue called Coatlicue, even though it is Coyolxauhqui that is decapitated and dismembered, it is the statue of Coatlicue that is depicted as a beheaded goddess with snakes in place of her missing head and limbs. And in some cases, serpents are released from Coatlicue's body upon her death. Coatlicue, along with Cihuacuatl, are both creator goddesses that not only were the protectors of the fertility of the land and its people, but also foundational mother figures that sacrificed themselves for the legacy of their people. Anne de Leon focuses on the statue of Coatlicue and concludes that, and I quote, "It symbolizes and narrates the violent birth of the Aztecs," end of quote, that mutilates and fractures the female body where rebirth of a nation is accomplished through death of the mother. It is interesting to point out that the statue itself was reburied 3 times because it was deemed at different times in history to be aesthetically unpleasing and dangerous, with its, and I quote, "the fusion of human and non-human forms." But what exactly makes this iconography of female creator goddess so unpleasing, so dangerous? Coatlicue's body is monstrous because it does not fulfill the mimetic concept of the female body and sexuality. As such, she has been further fragmented by the reassembling of her parts to a more patriarchal, acceptable composition of the Aztec mother figure that falls within the colonial, Christian, and Eurocentric model. Whereas in Aztec tradition, Coatlicue's body parts and ornamentation are used to denote gender, social class, and station, they are interpreted by the Spanish conquerors as monstrous figures that represent nothing more than masks that cover up the barbarity of the indigenous people. Specifically, Coatlicue's braided snake skirt mimics the sound of rain falling and emphasizes her role as goddess of Mother Earth, while also alluding to the midwife's apron that was believed to have the power to facilitate childbirth for women. Coatlicue was a creatrix goddess to whom human sacrifices were made, embodied in the double snake head and in the snakes in place of her dismembered limbs, as well as the skulls, hearts, and hands that constitute her necklace. Contrary to its negative significance in Christian ideology, serpents in indigenous mythology symbolize a never-ending cycle of life, death, and rebirth. Gaspar de Alba also associates the shedding of the snakeskin as a rising self-consciousness through personal transformation, and for women, the releasing of the power of the feminine. This embodiment intrinsically circumscribes the maternal female body within a dialectic of procreative power and androcentric feelings of both desire and horror towards the female body. Furthermore, close examination of the braided serpent skirt, in conjunction with description of Coatlicue's cavernous womb, allows one to speculate the existence of an internalized serpent, that is, the vagina dentata. Excuse me. Indeed, Coatlicoe's body has been thought to incorporate a textuality of horror, that is, not internally nor culturally constructed by the Aztecs, but rather one imposed and inherited by the male colonialist view of the female indigenous body. In essence, and I quote from Irene Lara, the maligning of goddesses transposes to the maligning of actual Nawa women, particularly healers, midwives, and, quote, harlots. By murdering the goddess, the Christian patriarchal ideologies eliminate the source of female power. In dismembering Coatlicoe's body, the same colonial power achieves a disarticulation of female body and speech. By extension, the virgin whore paradigm is not pre-Hispanic in origin, but part of the evangelization process of the Spanish conquest. That is, Spanish colonial discourse demonizes the female body, as seen with its treatment of the mother goddess Coatlicue, and transposes a patriarchal discourse onto indigenous and mestiza women, not only as an additional process of colonialization, but also control of the female body and sexuality. Cihuacuatl, Coatlicue, both have suffered the same process of transculturation and was depicted within colonial discourse as the demonized version of the good mother Tonantzin, who ultimately became the pagan version of the Virgin of Guadalupe, both embodiments of the unobtainable ideal of the perfect Virgin Mother. Irene Lara emphasizes that the placement of Coatlicue as another face of Tonantzin ultimately transformed her, and I quote, from a powerful mother goddess into a more passive mother of God. Like Coatlicue, Cihuacuatl's destructive powers are the focus of the male-dominated colonial discourse, and they both become associated with the Christian canon as another fallen Eve. The positioning of the good versus bad woman embodies what Gaspar de Alba has termed as the Three Maria syndrome. That is, a tripartite system of classification of female sexuality into virgins, mothers, or whores, in which motherhood becomes the highest expression of a good woman's socialization. And you can probably hear me putting square quotes around some of these terms. La Llorona, as I mentioned earlier, she's a ghost figure of a wailing woman dressed in white, doomed to roam the earth as a punishment for her past sins. From its earliest sources, the legend of La Llorona finds its roots in powerful mythological Aztec warrior goddesses, only to be consumed by colonialization and systemic racism, classism, misogyny, and sexism. I think I got all the isms in there. La Llorona's legend is a significant part of the Mexican and Mexican-American cultural imaginary, but has also been refigured into mainstream popular culture with certain cultural drawbacks. And one of the ones I'm still working through that I'm having issues with is the whitening process of the figure of La Llorona, the racial whitening. But more on back on that in a little bit. These contemporary versions are adaptations of the legend that reflect a current socio-political context, but in some cases, La Llorona's cultural meaning is sacrificed for market consumption. This presentation considers a selection also of representations of La Llorona as an ever-present undead figuration of colonial and feminist intersections of the sociocultural consumption of women within dominant androcentric discourses. Just as La Llorona consumes her victims, so too is her historical and cultural inheritance recolonized to diminish her power by enclosing her within the symbolic. It is a continued negotiation of what Gloria Anzaldúa has called lo heredado, lo adquirido, lo impuesto, and in English, the inherited, the acquired, and the imposed. Some variants of the legend of La Llorona depict her as a maligned mother, guilty of drowning her children, by focusing on the inequities of race, class, and gender experienced by women in patriarchally structured societies and in various historical time periods. La Llorona's legend has also been used as a boogeyman story, told to children to get them to behave, and also a cautionary tale to young women not to engage in premarital sex or seek partners outside their social class or race. As well as a third iteration, she can also be a vindictive ghost that entices wayward men to punish them for their indiscretions and or abusive behavior. The figure of La Llorona has proven to move beyond geographic, cultural, and historical boundaries. It has demonstrated to have cross-cultural and trans-historical persistence, since it remains a conclusive representation of the various ways that women continue to be victimized. The pre-colonial roots for La Llorona's legend are linked to the indigenous mythological figures of Coatlicue Indeed, the colonial discourse exemplifies the role of European males' gaze that views the female indigenous body as an extension of the savage land they have, again, discovered, that also needs to be dominated and conquered. Most importantly, Coatlicue prophesies the fall of the Aztec Empire to the Spanish and establishes a foundational narrative of the relationship between women dressed in white and a mother's wailing for her lost children. For example, a lot of these stories use the epithet, "Dear children, soon I am going to abandon you, we are going to leave." And this is a wail that is also associated with the legend of La Llorona. If one is to trace the maligned mother figure of La Llorona, we could begin with the indigenous roots of the historical figure of La Malinche. And La Malinche was an Aztec princess given to Hernán Cortés as a gift on his arrival in the New World in 1519. She not only becomes Cortés's translator and the key to many of his successes in conquering the New World and its indigenous peoples, but she also becomes his concubine and in some sources erroneously labeled as the mother of the first mestizo. In 1521, she was said to have given birth to a son, and in 1522, as the story goes, and here's where history and myth begin to blend, it's said that Cortés was preparing to return to Spain to marry a Spanish lady, and he planned to take his son with him. Feeling betrayed by Cortés, La Malinche realizes her role she herself played in the massacre of her own people, and she prays to her gods for guidance. One god answers her prayers and reveals to her that if she permits Cortés to take their son to Spain, that child would one day return to destroy her people, or essentially finish the job she started. In a mixture of feeling betrayed and abandoned by Cortés and the guilt of having aided him in the murder of her people and the prophecy of her son continuing the massacre if she allowed him to leave Spain, La Malinche escapes one night to the lake, upon which present-day Mexico City rests, and stabs the child in the heart before dropping his lifeless body into the water and crying out, "Oh, hijo mío, oh, my son." La Malinche subsequently died in 1529, and oral tradition has it that she can be seen at the lake's edge crying out for her dead children. Again, the distinctive epigraph to many of these Llorona accounts. The story of La Malinche portrays a certain shame and anxiety surrounding female reproduction, not only as an embodiment of the prevailing cultural fears of the power of the female body, as the carrier, and I'm quoting Almond here from a psychological perspective, the female body being the carrier of the bad seed. That is, that the child himself is seen as monstrous because he is the embodiment of what the mother hates about herself. Let us recall that, as historically documented, La Malinche suffered a traumatic childhood prior to her time as Cortés's interpreter. She was a princess sold into slavery by her own mother so that her brother could inherit the throne. She's passed from tribe to tribe as a slave, until being gifted to Cortés and ultimately to one of his generals. According to Almond, and quite apropos to the discussion here, it's not implausible to think that the fear La Malinche could have felt of what she could have passed on to her child, that is, the monster child could emerge from the monstrous mother. In killing the child, La Malinche is killing the bad parts of herself, but she cannot come to terms with her infanticide, and she ultimately commits suicide. There are a series of variants of the legend of La Llorona, leading from the account of La Malinche. In some accounts, the protagonist at times blames her Indian heritage for her misery, much the same way that Malinche blamed herself for the massacre of her people. For example, another account of this legend tells the story of a poor mestiza girl named Doña Luisa de Olveros. Like Malinche, she falls in love with a Spanish captain, has his children, and lives in a beautiful home, but is never given legal recognition of being his wife. When her Spanish lover admits to her that he would never marry her because of her race, she lashes out and stabs all 3 children with a dagger. She is subsequently condemned to death by the authorities and is said to be found roaming the streets on moonlit nights, dressed in white and crying out for her children. Both versions of the legend are linked not only by the fact that they encapsulate the lives of real women, one indigenous and one mestiza, but most importantly, they both serve as a warning to women against crossing of social classes and racial lines. From a feminist perspective, one could surmise that in these versions of La Llorona's wail or cry represents not only her only recourse within the colonialist patriarchal code of her society, but can extend to also include, and I'm quoting Anzaldúa, the Indian woman's only protest to her denigrated racialized status within her own cultural environment. The murdering of children can be metaphorically interpreted as a deadly returning of the children to the mother's protective womb. Similar to Almond's description of the vampiric mother, these mothers reclaim their children because of their compromised emotional state, which is emphasized by the perceived racial inferiority, poverty, and illegitimacy. It becomes evident that these, and I quote, child deaths occur where both social and intrapsychic conditions make mothering unbearable or impossible. Both La Malinche and Doña Luisa de Olveros are orphaned women set aside by their own race and their European lovers and never legitimized neither as wives nor as mothers. Instead, they have become historically documented examples of the maligned mother figures driven to acts of madness because of the unbearable social conditions within which they live. In modern day versions of the legend, one comes to notice that they're no longer necessarily focus on the denigrated figure of La Malinche, nor the venerated figure of the goddess. What becomes more salient in these versions, as we shall see, is the continued victimization of the female figure based on race and or social class. These versions continue to be influenced by the binary opposition of the whore virgin paradigm of La Malinche and the Virgin of Guadalupe, which are very prevalent in the Mexican cultural imaginary. The splitting of the good mother and bad mother has its precedence in the fragmentation of the goddess Coatlicue into numerous descendants that exemplify this very binary opposition of motherhood. So we have Tonantzin and Coatlicue are the good mothers, and Cihuacuatl and eventually La Malinche as the bad mothers. As a result, there is a splitting of the female self into good, light versus bad, dark, that breaks with the expectations of women to be silent, subservient, and suffering mothers. Institutionalized religion has also been a dominant factor in casting the role of women and prompting situations in which La Llorona figures in history have found themselves defined and limited to their positions as mothers and wives. And in Malinche's case, historically framed as the traitress of her people and a negative mother figure for the entire Mexican race. Therefore, in 1531, the Mexicans replaced the negative mother figure with the Virgin of Guadalupe, a mestiza version of the Christian figure of Mary, dark-skinned and dark-haired, and a desexualized and passive image of a virgin mother. Anzaldúa also points out the need to unlearn this unreal idealization, to borrow Deborah Castillo's term, of a passive female sexuality in the virgin whore paradigm, and recognize that Coatlicue also exists in Guadalupe. And you actually have it in this representation here, the melding of the two figures. It is within this binary opposition that we can situate La Llorona as the third mother of the Mexican race, in that, and I quote Anzaldúa, all three are mediators. Guadalupe, the Virgin, who has not abandoned us, and she's referring to Chicanos. La Chingada, which in Mexican Spanish means the fucked mother. Hopefully we don't get censored for that. The raped mother whom we have abandoned, and La Llorona, the mother who seeks her lost children and is a combination of the other two. When I talk about this to my students, I get them to think of a triangle where you have that idealized Virgin Mother at the peak, and then the more earthbound mothers of La Llorona and La Malinche at the base of the triangle. Oral and written stories of La Llorona in a colonial context tend to focus on indigenous, mestiza, and or poor La Llorona figures who have been abandoned, abused, and or cheated on by their lover or husband. In earlier work, I have indicated that these oral and written iterations of the legend blend both historical and fictional accounts, where at times it is difficult to differentiate fiction and non-fictional elements. The dominant discourse underlying these versions depicts the colonial inheritance of indigenous or mestiza women being used by Spanish males, having their children, only to be disowned and never given legal recognition of their relationship. These women find themselves abandoned, ignored, and silenced in life. So in death, they roam the streets at night, dressed in white, crying out for their dead children, haunted by their murderous actions, and haunting the living as a reminder of their own sad stories. Now, the film Yoko, La Llorona, The Curse of Weeping Women, just as a little side comment, some films are better than others. I'll just leave it at that. But I think there's something to be said, even the ones that are not that great. So in Yoko, 2007 production, it references the Mayan name, which is for La Llorona, and the story of the Mayan woman who killed her children and committed suicide after being abandoned by her Spanish lover. Unlike the grim episode, this La Llorona does not kidnap other children to replace them to use them to replace her own lost children. In this particular one, which is rather interesting, she only takes children who come out of broken homes. That is, the impetus to take the children is not purely selfish, but rather saving them after being abandoned by their own mothers. Even though the grim episode modernizes La Llorona's portrayal whilst remaining true to its cultural coding, it does so by using the Hispanic character of Valentina as a mediator, as a cultural translator. She is a retired police officer whose nephew was one of La Llorona's victims. And she is able to translate La Llorona's story for the non-Hispanic detective Grimm. Again, in 2007, Roberto Castañeda has Kilómetro 31, and he interprets the legend as a cautionary message for young women not to cross social or racial lines in their relationships. And this one, the Spanish soldier is takes on a poor indigenous woman as his lover. She becomes because his legitimate wife is unable to provide him with children. Other modern day versions of La Llorona depict a young wife abandoned by her husband because she's less attractive after having his children, and her children become the obstacle to keeping her husband, finding a new husband, or winning back a lover. Some modern renditions add a dialectic of mother blame to the colonial criticisms, and also in addition to racism, classism, and sexism. Andres Muschietti 2013 film Mama takes place outside of Mexico and features the ghost of a young white American woman who haunts a cabin in the woods. Mama killed herself in the 1880s by jumping off a cliff whilst escaping from a mob of men who wanted to return her to the mental asylum, having been committed there for just being an unwed mother. The impetus here for Mama is to be reunited with her child, who was precipitously taken away from her, a child she replaces with two girls she saves from being killed by their own father. So this is a bit of a switch that it's the father figure killing the children. So in Mama, you have that, and you also have that in Shutter Island, another film. In Mama, Mama's wailing cry is emphasized in the film's music score with a haunting lullaby, a similar technique applied in The Curse of La Llorona. And this is in the attempt, I find, to humanize La Llorona and emphasize her suffering and her victimization by her society. However, the Disney Pixar production Coco modifies the song as a lament and a love for La Llorona. And just a partial lyrics, I won't stop loving you. And even if it costs me my life, Llorona, I won't stop loving you. So it takes a bit of a romantic switch. Now, Octavio Paz, in his seminal work, Labyrinth of Solitude, he provided the lens through which La Malinche really became the denigrated, raped mother. His reading is done predominantly through a patriarchal lens and has intrinsically fertilized the Chicana response to the feminist recovery of a more positive figure of La Malinche by seeking a more authentic representation of women in general. Chicana artists and writers have reclaimed the mother figures of La Malinche and the Virgin of Guadalupe and La Llorona by writing and painting the female body via a Chicana écriture féminine. It is a recovery of female reproduction and motherhood by giving birth to a concept of female sexuality that is absorbed as authentic and not externally imposed. Chicana artist Alma Lopez has come under much criticism for her depiction of the Virgin of Guadalupe in a self-portrait because, in the attempt to have it, and I quote, more accurately signify her own experience as sexed, gendered, raced, and classed body in patriarchy, end of quote, it countered the idealization of the traditional desexualized and passive construct. That is, the Chicana movement is responding to the patriarchal demonization of powerful Mexican female deities and female sexuality to remember or put together and heal the fragmented female body. In reconstructing the dismembered body of the mother goddess, Chicana artists are actively decolonizing the colonial patriarchal cultural imaginary and rescuing Coatlicue and her equivalents from the margins, and ultimately from erasure. Chicana art and literature actively revisions the cultural images of La Malinche into La Virgen and La Llorona as positive, active female figures of womanhood and motherhood. There is a marked movement from passive to active agents in the construction of both personal and national identity. In her book, Toward a Latina Feminism in the Americas, Chicana writer Ana Marie Sandoval makes an interesting distinction, and she states, Chicanas write against a national discourse that does not recognize them. End of quote. It is in that vein that Chicana artists and writers have been critical of the traditional depiction of these cultural figures of womanhood. Remembering Coatlicue intrinsically deconstructs the patriarchal myth of the sexual and spiritual repression of women to replace it with a system of sexual subjugation with one of female empowerment. Lada terms it as a method of, and I quote, putting flesh back on the object to obtain a full female subjectivity despite the idolization of the female body, as in Tonatzin and Guadalupe archetype. Much of their work can be characterized by a desire to work towards historically contextualizing these female icons as figures of resistance and representatives of cultural survival. In the same way that many Mexicans have crossed the Rio Grande into California and areas of Texas, so has the legend of La Llorona extended into the United States. In the short story, Woman Hollering Creek, Chicana writer Sandra Cisneros appropriates the folkloric tradition of La Llorona to embody not only the issue of female identity, but also the question of Chicana identity. In the short story, the female protagonist, Cleofilas, marries an American and moves from her small Mexican town to its Texan counterpart. At the back of her house runs Hollering Creek. And you've got the full quote there on the slide, whose name no one from these parts questioned, little less understood. Pues allá de los indios, ¿quién sabe? Well, that's stuff of the Indians, who knows? Unlike the previously discussed variants, the body of water here does not represent the site of infanticide and suicide, but rather an empowering appropriation for Cleofilas of the culture she left behind. The water imagery here is not one of a destructive force, but one of a promising freedom, a rebirth. As a reflection of Coatlicue's power, the creek is named La Gritona, or Woman Hollering Creek, as opposed to La Llorona, Woman Wailing Creek. Cisneros' refiguration of the legend changes La Llorona's wail or cry into a holler and a shout of female empowerment, of newfound self-esteem, while confronting issues of misogyny, domestic abuse, and Chicana identity. Just so, I don't know if you can see, but the writing on the branches here. When Cihuacuatl learns to seduce, La Llorona emerges. When Lilith learns to cry, La Llorona emerges. This is probably one of my favorite artistic representations. In the horror film trilogy, The Wailer, so we've got a 2006, 7, and 12 trilogy. Though La Llorona's name is featured in the title of each film, her story functions more as a backdrop to the overall filmic narrative. The first film merely references the myth of an indigenous woman who drowns her children to please her lover, while the second film references cultural adaptations of indigenous iterations. The trilogy ends with a modern adaptation of the punitive version of La Llorona, a ghost seeking revenge on the descendants of her cheating husband by haunting not a lake, not a river, but a pool of the ancestral home. Other punitive iterations of La Llorona depict her as a ghost who cries out while swimming in a river. She cries to entice men to come and save her from drowning, only to drown them herself, so to punish them. The Brazilian equivalent of La Llorona actually entices men deep into the Amazon so that they get lost and they die in the Amazon jungle. Although rooted in the Mexican indigenous mythology of strong warrior women who were also dedicated mothers, the legend of La Llorona over time has been subverted by patriarchy and institutionalized religion to represent a negative and often despised representation of femininity and motherhood. That is to say, the strong mother figures of Coatlicue and Cihuacuatl are replaced by negative images of the traitress, La Malinche, and the desexualized and passive mothering of the etherealized Virgin of Guadalupe. In the end, most of the existing variants of this legend, as we have seen, represent La Lloronas as archetypal evil women, not only for having murdered their children, but also for attempting to overcome the social barriers of class and race. For her transgression, she is fated to roam the earth, searching for her dead children, never to find peace. These external forces of social class, culture, race, and religion have constructed an idealized definition of both motherhood and womanhood that set these women up for failure because it refuses intrinsically to recognize and accept any other definition of the perfect mother. Moreover, contemporary variants and depictions of La Llorona continue to allude to the effects of Spanish colonization and institutionalized patriarchy, whilst also championing a dialectic of resistance, survival, and subversiveness. Nevertheless, La Llorona's roots in strong indigenous warrior women are relegated to a symbolic value in the marketplace by being consumed by recolonization via persistent misogyny, sexism, racism, and classism over time and across geographical borders. Colonial and patriarchal discourse have used La Llorona as the archetype of the evil, mad, murderous woman that is the product of the dominant discourses of intersectional feminism and colonialism in the cultural marketplace. La Llorona may still be an undead figure consuming children and wayward men, but she is also consumed by cultural products such as television, film, and media. It is a critique that La Llorona's roots in indigenous mythology have been refigured under Spanish colonization and then recolonized by its consumerization in the 20th and 21st centuries. Despite the instances in transmedial representation within which La Llorona's legend is disassociated from her roots in Aztec mythology, her wail continues to disrupt hegemonic codes to avoid being silenced, ignored, forgotten, and even consumed. And my last slide, speaking of consuming, and I can't show you the video, is the Got Milk ad that was released in California in 2004. And La Llorona is essentially wailing and crying because there's no milk in the fridge. So there you have it.
Thank you. Can we return to just you and me, perhaps? Cristina?
Yes, I'm here. Hold on a
Oh,
second.
I was asking if we could stop sharing screen so I could actually see you.
I'm trying to do this, and this is being, oh, no.
It's being technology.
I know. Why is this being so problematic right now? I had it all working.
There we go.
Yay!
Thank you. I was getting frustrated because as you were saying things, like I was writing notes, and then you would say the thing that I had written in my notes. And I was like, well, okay. So I feel like I was really following you because I was right there with the next step, ready to
We
go
were
with you.
we were syncing.
We were like, and it was funny because I actually told Juan, I was like, she's like 3 times in a row, same thing I just wrote down.
I tell you, La Llorona, she appears.
I guess so. Have you? I mean, so you watched Supernatural? What? That's 16 years ago.
Yeah, the pilot was released in 2005.
Yeah.
So it's been a while, and that was their pilot episode.
Were you a fan?
I have to admit, I probably watched up to until season 3
Okay.
of Supernatural. It started getting a bit too convoluted, but I have to say, knowing that it's ended just recently,
Yep.
I've had it's on my list to rewatch the whole thing now.
Oh, wow.
So I know that would take me ages, but I'm wanting to rewatch it.
I mean, it was supposed to end in season 5, and they kept going because it was so popular, and it was the 2 stars, Jensen Ackles and Jared Padalecki, that decided to finally step away.
Yes.
I
It's
watched
been
it all in real time, unfortunately.
Was it like 15? Was it 15?
15 seasons.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's pretty long run for a series.
Yeah, especially on the CW. So
Yeah.
I mean, it certainly propped them up for a while. I had actually forgotten that the first episode was about La Llorona. I remember there was a woman in white.
Yeah, it's that pilot episode actually blends 2 legends.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So it blends the legend of the Highwayman,
yes,
and the punitive version of La Llorona, where she is abandoned by her husband to go with his lover, and she kills her children. But
we see his ghost too, right?
Pardon me?
We see his ghost too, don't we?
I don't recall. I only recall her ghost until the brothers finally figure out the only way to vanquish her is by making her enter the house and be reunited with her children.
Right.
And the interesting part, when they're reunited, the children and the mother, and they're hugging, they dissolve into a puddle of water.
I don't remember that. I do remember going into the house, and I remember she appears in their car.
Yes.
Like she doesn't realize she's a ghost.
She haunts that strip of road to catch, and she's trying to entrap one of the brothers to cheat on his girlfriend, I think, at the time.
Yeah, Sam.
Yes, and he doesn't fall for it. And then in the mirror, he sees not the beautiful version of the lady, but actually sees the ghost figure, which is very scary with the long nails. And she attacks him in the car until he drives the car through the house.
Right.
That's how he gets her to get in the house.
But enough about Supernatural. Let's get into the real meat and potatoes. Supernatural is not a bad one though, just for the amount of esoterica it brings forward, and I think makes people aware of, because obviously running for 15 years, they had to mine everything they possibly could. Some maybe better than others. I get like when you're talking about this, I guess my initial impulse is to become super psychoanalytical. I mean, you cited a super psychoanalytical reading anyway with Holman.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm going to dive in with both feet there. I'm going to go with Lacan first, because we are talking about mothers. I mean, you could for Freud, I'll get to it in a second, but my reading.
Freud had a lot to say about mothers.
Yeah, I mean, but this, I mean, is in terms of Freud, it's anti-Oedipal. It's almost the opposite of the Oedipus complex, or it's the fear of the Oedipus complex that actually resolves, rather than how Freud speculated it should resolve. But I think the Lacanian reading is much more fascinating in relationship to this, because of the identity politics it brings in to a reading of La Llorona, and also the various other figures you brought forward. And so I wonder if you could speak a bit more about that in terms of cultural identification, reflexivity, and moving forward, I post like mid 90s, reclamation of the figure in popular culture, as these sort of like takes on re-understanding and I guess untransculturating.
I think the main my interest has always been how are we, and I'm not going to do a gendered view on it, but how are we the products of the environment we live in, right? And then how does that impact identity formation, depending on gender, social class, race, etc. Within the Mexican cultural imaginary, there's a pre-colonial root source of active, powerful mother figures who can be warrior women, who know the healing of the body. So there is that identifier for the Mexican cultural imaginary. Octavio Paz, when he comes out with Labyrinth of Solitude, identifies La Malinche as the raped, or in Mexican Spanish, as the fucked mother, who is, and that's the reason for the problems that Mexican nationalism and feelings about it. And then he goes into, well, machos, machismo, men have to be like this. So a cultural coding of what a real man is, just as much as how the cultural coding is impacting female identity. He also established it on how men identify as macho, no? And I think his seminal work really drew on the idea of the gaze, of how you are seen, right? Because of this historical root. And it became a very negative inheritance, right, of colonialism, that we're the children of a raped mother, right? Yes, La Virgen de Guadalupe becomes this positive image, but she's still a Christian image. Even though she looks like the Mexican race, she's still a Christian image. But then you also have it created in a very passive mode. And so what happens here is there has to be a reclamation, right? Of a more positive identity, of this more positive birth of the Mexican people. Chicanas are add another layer of complication. Chicana identity, I like how Anzaldúa talks about it as it's a borderland. She got 1 foot on one side, 1 foot on the other. She doesn't belong entirely on one or the other side because she's both. So it's a borderland. And I think, again, speaking outside of the culture, I'm not part of the culture, but looking into it and my own background, I get it, because you don't, where is home? You have all these other environmental factors telling you, you have this historical inheritance, and it's the need to find that the borderland can be both. And I think that in that negotiation of this non-binary identification, so also, you know, non-heteronormative identification, especially, there is this view or this identity negotiation of being who you think you are, of authenticity, and not how you're expected to be or prescribed to be. And I think we see a lot of those negotiations in that artwork of reclaiming these figures, reclaiming them not from the raped mother that Paz establishes, but saying, no, we have, these are positive figures, these, we can reclaim them as as new mothers as authentic mothers. So I don't know if that.
No, I mean, it's so much. I mean, I rarely sit back because my lighting changes so much when I do, but no, so much to unpack in that
Oh my,
response.
we have a visitor.
We what? Is it La Llorona? Is that the
No,
cat's name?
it's my cat.
It'd be a great name for a cat, La Llorona.
The next one, I'm going to do it.
I need a picture with the tag, and I will tweet. I will tweet it out. No, so much to unpack. What a thoughtfully great answer. I want to latch onto the gaze for a second because I'm really interested in this, and I'm particularly interested in this in terms of contemporary representation in the concept of horror, because we do think traditionally of the male gaze in relationship to these things. However, in this program, one of the things I've strived to do this, particularly in this year, is to discuss the female gaze that's sort of like newly interjected. And so let me ask you a couple of questions on that. The male gaze is framed negatively. It is a negative condition, right? That's how it's written to be. So my first query on trying to understand the female gaze, and I talked to other people like Anna Biller when we did the Love Witch and things about this, because I consider that to be the first horror movie that deals with the female gaze. More recently in 2020, you had Violation. So I'm curious what your take is on the female gaze, and if it functions similarly to the male gaze, if it has the same negative connotations as the male gaze, what are the possibilities and limitations of that gaze? And I mean, and I mean this more of a ubiquitous way, not just specifically cultural.
That's a hard question.
Well, I mean, I'm kind of obsessing over it anymore because it's so new to the field.
It's funny that you mentioned the negative interpretation that the male gaze has taken on. That and that the female gaze has been a reactionary construct against the male gaze. And we know, the little bit I know, of women in film production, women in those fields are still emerging, and it's hard. They're getting representation. I think looking at not so much film, but looking at what I know a bit more and like to look at is those pieces of art by Chicana artists that are looking at these icons of femininity, of motherhood, that have been historically constructed via not only the male gaze, but Eurocentric Christian gaze, colonial gaze. And you can see by looking at them beside each other, how they are very, beyond being passive, they're very static, desexualized representations. Whereas I find with those pieces by Chicanas, there is this very fluid humanness, like fullness to the body. It's not presented as a function, a body just as a reproductive function, but rather a body that lives and breathes, that changes, that's malleable. And that to me is the striking difference in the gaze in those pieces of art. And like, if we look at Malinche, we have a lot of historical texts about her. We have her translating, so we have her voice in some of these texts, but it's not her words, right? So it's not really her voice. She's just translating. So for a historical figure like that, who is present, but she's not present, I think the female gaze adds that humanness to that representation. It goes beyond being the function of being that raped mother, for example, to being a woman who lived and breathed, a woman who suffered, a woman who agonized. There's that multidimensionality that's added to these bodies.
I'm sort of like thinking back to the beginning of your talk to with Guadalupe, and I'm going to do like a juxtaposition here that might be strange. I'm thinking as an art historian, I would think as a slide comparison, that one, and then the Laocoon, which is the priest of Troy that's being attacked by the snake that's at the Vatican. If you're not familiar with that piece. Okay, it's not a big deal. Michelangelo was obsessed with it.
You're just adding to my list for me to...
Yeah, so real quick, Laocoon was the Trojan priest who did not trust the Trojan horse. He whacks the side of it with a staff. Poseidon, which is how we also get Medusa, attacks Laocoon with a snake and kills his children. And we see him wrestling with the snake and it biting inside. He is surging outward and all of his muscles are bulging, which in Greek aesthetics is ugly because you want to look like Apollo. You want to be calm, lean, young, and beautiful, right? That's the classic Western symbol of male beauty, is the body of Apollo. So Laocoon is the classic Western example of the grotesque. And that's where I'm getting at with this. That's the really quick idea here, because what you see in Guadalupe is the application again of snakes, which is interesting because snakes seem to be a universal concept around making something grotesque, again thinking to Medusa in this context,
or having it perceived as grotesque.
Absolutely, right. And it seems to be, as you I think rightfully pointed out, that it's this dominance over phallocentrism culturally across the board, but then when you onlay the colonial aspect of Catholicism to it, it asserts sort of Eve dominance over the serpent as well. And I think that's truly fascinating.
And that's why that statue of Guadalupe was found and reburied 3 times, because they could not, it was so grotesque, they reburied it 3 times.
That's actually why I thought Laocoon, because they actually bury that statue as well.
Oh, well, there you go. Yeah, it's, and the fact that serpents are very much, well, in Guadalupe's story, but the serpent skirt, which is used by midwives, it has like, think of like little chiming bells to help midwives, help women have children. So it's linked to midwifery in Aztec culture. It's linked to rebirth or a new self. And it makes me think of Medusa, who was also raped in some versions of her story, right?
But if nothing else, punished for sexuality, at the very least.
Yeah, and how that's taken on, like you said, she becomes a bad mother because of the grotesque of being partially animal and a serpent and human, and the fact that her necklace is human parts of humans that have been sacrificed to her. That could add to it too,
It is interesting. So, I mean, obviously, in terms of typical semiotic ideas of the grotesque, right? The deployment of the phallus towards the female figure is one of the more common
Mhm.
grotesque moves across sort of art history. But it also re-fetishizes it
Mhm.
rather
Yeah.
fascinatingly. And I like this idea of the almost inverted and then pulsating idea of the phallus, of the internal serpent.
Yeah, and I don't know if I had it there, but the hieroglyphics at one of the temples, one of the Aztec hieroglyphics, actually have a figure of Coatlicue who's sitting somewhat squatting,
Okay.
and literally a snake is coming out of her vagina, essentially, right between her legs. So I always think of Freud and castration anxiety.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's so clear, this whole thing, in terms of, I mean, if he had known about this, I think he would have had like a spell, because I mean, I mentioned before, it's so anti-Oedipus. It's the mother penetrating the son to death as well.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
is the complete opposite of the Oedipus complex, right?
Yeah.
So,
and it's actually the daughter who tries to kill the mother.
yeah, so I
And
mean,
then
so not
the-
Clytemnestra either.
yeah, and then it's the son, so the child that is born from Coatlicue, who saves the mother, but chops up his sister in many pieces and throws her body pieces down. That makes me think of the Osiris,
Oh yeah.
right? So here we have this commonalities throughout different cultures that I always find them quite interesting to draw these threads together.
No, definitely. And it is fascinating to just see sort of like the obsession with this as a concept transculturally, globally. I mean,
Well, there's the film Teeth,
there is, you're right.
right?
Yes.
That
Yes.
that brought
The ultimate vagina dentata.
and it kind of links it back to the environment, right? Because of those silos at the back of the house, and they think it's environmental pollution because the mother gets breast cancer, and that might be a oddity because of these environmental factors have made her like that.
Well, it's interesting because you ended with the got milk thing, right?
Mhm.
And there's always been like a cult and fetishization about breast milk as well, and how that links to being a good and bad mother. I mean, Romulus and Remus, right? That's a classic story of that.
Yeah. I have the amount of mother blame when it comes to breastfeeding. It's like between breastfeeding and not having natural births, somehow that makes you less of a mother, because there's still this expectation of what the good mother should be. And then you have, well, if you're not doing this, then you're a bad mother. And my question has always been, well, can't we just have a good enough mother? Right. And it's that breaking that binary that seems to be constantly bringing, certain points up that define women within such restrictive roles. And I'm speaking of women because of today's topic. It can
Oh, absolutely. No,
it can be brought up for others. Other topics.
Well, I wonder too, because you bring in the Virgin Mary in terms of the colonialism to the piece, and it's like, I don't. Does she breastfeed? Do we see a scene in the Bible of the Virgin Mary breastfeeding?
Not that I know, but
yeah, I don't know.
No, no, wait, isn't there an I'm bad in art history, but I seem to recall a portrait of Mary with the baby Jesus at her breast. Am I wrong? I'm not the art historian here, but
yeah, but I'm not. I mean, it sounds like a Renaissance piece, and I'm definitely not.
Right?
But no, I'm curious. I would need to look into exactly where we see it, I guess, if we do
Yeah.
see it. But I would be curious. I would be curious to how that's been read by theologians over the years as well, because I mean, I've heard a lot of different. We've had a lot of biblical scholars on this year, and that's never come up. But I would be curious as to like how that's been interpreted and read and what it means, because it is in some ways an odd intrusion on the Eucharist too.
I'd be interested in if somebody could give us some insights on that, that'd be quite interesting, because that's the thing. When they introduce the Virgin of Guadalupe, it gives them a Mary that looks like them, that is supposed to make the evangelization process easier so that they can keep getting funding from Spain to keep discovering all these new lands, right? So as a Latin Americanist, the discovery of the new world, this whole colonialization concept, let's be truthful, it wasn't for evangelization. That gave them the money to do it, but it was for all the gold and silver and everything they were sending back to Spain, right? So one thing I wanted to go back, like when you brought up theology and the good bad mother, I didn't mention it today because it just wouldn't fit, but I always go back and we have real instances of lloronas happening. Think of Andrea Yates. She was married. She had 5 children. With each child, her postpartum went from depression to psychosis, severe psychosis, where she was getting professional treatment for the psychosis. She could not be home alone with the children. So her mother-in-law was with them. One day, the husband, after having all this supervision, decided, oh, she's better. She can be left alone with the children. That day, she drowned all 5 children in their bathtub. When she was taken to court, the court transcripts described her explanation, and she said that she felt she was a bad mother. And for being such a bad mother, she believed her children were destined to hell. And they found that in some of her exchanges with her pastor, her minister, actually built on these feelings of inadequacy, right? We still have that religious element there. And already with the postpartum psychosis, she broke. The one part I found interesting was when they interviewed the husband afterwards and said, well, what are you going to do? You've lost all 5 children. Your wife killed them. How do you feel? And he said, well, it's really sad we lost the other 5 children, but I hope my wife can come home soon and we can just have more children.
Okay.
So this is real. And this is, there's that cultural expectations, these external pressures of being the good mother, that if you can't fulfill them, it's not good enough. You can't have that middle ground, that middle ground that means you're good enough. It's either good or bad. And the whole idea you brought up about, can you breastfeed?
We've got some information here on it. So it's called the Madonna Lactalis, which are representations of the Virgin Mary breastfeeding. They seem to be popular in the late Middle Ages, early Renaissance. They look a lot like the first one I've been sent here by my producer, Juan, is very Greek Orthodox looking. The second one looks more Western. Barnaba de Modena, 1350. And apparently Mary also breastfeeds Bernard of Clairvaux as a saint as well.
Oh.
So we did get some research in for you.
I'm gonna.
I'll email it.
I'll
email it to you
on that last one.
Yeah, I'll email you all this.
Okay, excellent.
But just to we like to be as factual as possible here on Spooky Evenings. So shout out to Juan for some really quick.
Yes, wonderful.
And he's very into Mary Andre. So yeah, we found out some research that fast for you. I always think of the French Revolution because they had festivals of breastfeeding and they actually built statues that lactated during the French Revolution, which is the weirdest thing to me, but that has neither here nor there.
But here, just building off of this,
yeah,
there's this championing of being able to breastfeed.
Yes.
Yet don't do it in public. Don't.
But it depends who you are in some ways though too, right?
I find it's not, it's how it's perceived by others in public.
Absolutely. But what my point here is, let's take a massive pop cultural icon. Let's say if Beyonce breastfed in public, it would be praised. It wouldn't be demonized. Whereas average woman on the street, it becomes more demonized. And I think this gets to sort of a more classist view of this triumvirate that you've pointed out, the idea of the virgin mother whore as well. I mean, because the other thing here too is this is also the three Marys. Right? It's the Virgin Mary, Jesus' mother, her cousin Mary, and Mary Magdalene, who's the composite of other women herself. But it's that same thing, right? It's a status move, and it's also just like how that can be purified and shifted, which makes a lot of sense in terms of talking about this in regards to monstrosity.
It's also part of the abject.
Absolutely.
It's the leaky substance that Kristeva talks about. And I find there's a difficulty in perception of breasts are not sexualized. They're feeding a child. They are a natural part of the process of being a mother. Yet they, by some, like you said, there's the class difference. There's also the racial difference of who isn't seen as grotesque or gross in doing the act, being able to do it in public or in a restaurant or wherever it may be. But I agree with you. There is a class distinction. There's a racial distinction. And again, there's also this inheritance that when formula first came out, it was a sign of class that you could afford, you did. And even earlier on, nursing maids that were used for upper class mothers to nurse their own, have nursing maids for their children. So I think it's something that across history, and it's still with us today, that we're still having a hard time negotiate this part of the female body because it's leaky. It actually is able to feed another human being. So not only is the female body able to grow another child and is able to shift everything to give life, it can also feed that child.
Sure.
And I always go back to Kristeva's the leakiness, the liquid.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's also the sort of like, again, the Freudian rejection of the male orgasm in its own way too, right? It doesn't come from the genitalia; it comes from the breast. Right? It's so many different things that reject heteronormativity.
Yeah.
Even though it's in its own way the most heteronormative thing ever, because it's part of the reproduction of people.
Yeah. I think it's in a lot of these anxieties and fears and need to restrict, need and to clearly label things. It's about the audience or the individual's comfort level.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
We have this pushback on this whole idea of gender binary, that gender binarism is not a binary. But you get a lot of pushback because it makes it uncomfortable for people not to have those nice, clean delineations. And I think when we talk about people being perceived demonized, bad, not good enough, that's why I like psychoanalysis. You have to look at, why do you think that?
Yep.
Right? There has to be something that makes you feel that way.
Sure. It's interesting. So as part of Spooky Evenings, we actually have a show up at the gallery at the university here. And we have 2 blue velvet posters. Right. And Dennis Hopper's character enacts this performance of being a baby.
Okay.
In relationship to the prostitute in Blue Velvet. Right. And it's the same idea here. He's villainized. He is the villain, and he enacts this infantilized male relationship to baby functions as well, because it's grotesque and repellent, right? That fetish is what David Lynch maximizes to push us away as the viewer.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's fascinating. I do want to switch gears a little here because I've kept you quite long, and I do want to get to some other things.
My.
Yeah, I want to get to this idea of the white clothing of La Llorona, because I view it as very colonial.
Yes, in some versions, it's actually her bridal dress.
I assumed it was that, or communion,
it's a veil.
First communion kind of situation.
Yeah, it's because of that unrequited love or marriage, where she's not legitimized as the wife. So it's that unrequited desire to be the legitimate wife, and the white dress and the veil that she was never able to get in life.
Which is such a common Gothic kind of trope, right? We see it in Dracula. You see Mrs. Havisham, right?
Oh, yeah.
She's in her deteriorating dress while still alive in Dickens. So it is interesting.
I watched Crimson Peak.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Crimson Peak. And they put them in those tub things and their bridal gowns. Yeah.
Like gooey blood. And I was like, this means something.
Well,
but I don't have time to work on it right now.
I also thought to The Ring as well in relationship to that, to transculturate it further, right?
Yes.
Ringu, I should say.
Yes. And again, she's in white.
And she comes out of an orifice. She comes out of a well, and then comes out of another orifice and is drenched.
Yeah. Yeah.
And particularly it's men that seem to fall into the punishment of summoning her. So it is interesting to see how far this story transculturates.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, in England, it becomes the woman in white, the woman in black.
Yeah.
And then you get different New England stories around it. But it does originate, I think, more in the 15th century as you situate it. I think that's correct.
I think somebody also once mentioned to me in England, Bloody Mary.
Oh yeah, Bloody Mary. But she's still later, right?
Yeah.
Bloody Mary's a real person. Bloody Mary is Queen Elizabeth, the first sister.
was what, that would be what year?
Late 1500s, early 1600s. So this is the one that, all right, so this is the daughter of Catherine of Aragon.
Yeah.
So Catherine of Aragon marries Henry VIII after his brother dies at their wedding, right? And supposedly she's still a virgin. And so he marries her, but she doesn't have a male heir, which is actually what creates what we now think of Church of England and Episcopalianism, which certainly plenty to read and infer into that, not to mention the legacy of colonialism under Elizabeth. But Mary, which shouldn't be confused with Mary of Scots, who is Elizabeth's cousin, who she has murdered. She is queen. Very briefly, she marries Philip of Spain. He can't stand her. She has a hysterical pregnancy as well.
Oh my.
But she burns Protestants.
Yeah.
So that's where Bloody Mary comes from. But it's still later.
Yeah, there you go.
But it still ties in really nicely with this idea of colonialism, the madness of the woman in relationship to her womb, and the legacy of violence. And also then this children's story of, because this happened to me as a kid. I was actually just writing about this the other night in relation to the Candyman, of going into the bathroom and saying, like, back when I was a kid, we had these two older kids were my neighbors, and they convinced me to go into like their bathroom and say Bloody Mary, and one of them was hiding in the shower and leapt out at me. And I've never had a jump scare affect me ever since, kind of funnily, but I tore out of their house, like screaming.
That you mentioned Candyman, I've been thinking about when I was writing La Llorona, and the fact that the new Candyman just came out.
Yeah.
I haven't seen it yet, but the racial commentaries being made, I find really telling, because again, it's that colonial thread.
They change it quite a lot from the 92.
Did they?
And he's more like a construct of an idea rather than a singularity. Not to be a spoiler, but
okay.
I think it works better in the original as a singularity, because I think you need this solid mythos, which
I found very telling in the original.
Yeah,
that strong situatedness of how it came to be is very telling.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I just want to return to the idea of as maybe a penultimate question here, of the image of these women shifting into colonialized figures, and assuming more sort of westernized a la Grec, right? White dresses, very a la Grec clothing, as opposed to the more traditional objects you already spoke about, like the midwife apron of snakes and the bells and things. I just want to hang up on that for a second, if we can.
So there's a bit of a culture of erasure of those strong indigenous goddess warriors. And very true. They are replaced with a very Europeanized dress. They are miscegenated, so they are now a combination of indigenous and Spanish. So they begin to look different. They dress, the colonial discourse takes over in how they look, how they dress, and then in the belief systems that are then instituted and start to grow. One thing is the idea around the return of reassessing or recovering indigeneity, the value of those pre-colonial roots, and especially the idea of having more of a positive genesis to Mexican culture, as opposed to having been a very denigrated genesis. Though in watching these films, yes, some of them were a bit laborious to watch. Let's put it that
Aaron
way.
Renner last night watched all 12 Children of the Corn, so.
Oh, but okay, she's got me beat.
She's got everyone beat. No one should have to do that. That's like, you should be brought before, I should be brought before the Hague for making her do that.
I'm especially with the last one, The Curse of La Llorona, I think it was 2019.
Yeah.
And having listened to Bernadette's talk the other night, we're losing the cultural racial representation. If you have La Llorona in the title of the film,
Sure.
it has to be culturally true.
You're asking way too much of films.
I know. In the perfect world, and it's in Brazil.
You're talking to the guy who's written 47 pages on Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Oh. But I'm finding this whitening process in her depiction, the loss of that of this rich history into a mere 2-minute start to the film, and then the rest is like cabin in the woods almost.
Absolutely.
And it's like, okay, so you're using it to sell it. You're using it to sell a car.
I had not seen that one. That was
it was one of my slides, and I
saw your slide. I was laughing so hard when I saw it because I was just the absurdity.
Exactly, and in that absurdity, in that consumerization, you're losing this strong cultural heritage.
Sure.
I also think about it in the realm of looking at the treatment of Indigenous women and girls, because this is a very strong root in how Indigenous women have been treated. And we continue to see it in the growing femicides. Here in Canada, we have hundreds and hundreds of missing women and girls and murdered girls that cannot be accounted for. You have all the femicides happening at the Juarez, Texas border. And I find the loss of that cultural heritage is an erasure of the value that it has as a cultural value. It's not appropriation. It's not cultural appropriation, but it's being consumed. It's being consumed, and the weight and value of these cultural figures is being lost.
There's another painting. I mean, it's not. It's slightly different, but the same topic. There's another painting I want to draw your attention to. It's in the U.S. Capitol. Actually, it's in the Rotunda.
Okay.
And it's by John Gadsby Chapman from 1840, and it's the Baptism of Pocahontas.
Oh, I gotta write that down.
Yeah, it's actually a terrible painting. I went to undergrad at William and Mary, so I went to school right next to Jamestown, and I've seen the site, the reconstruction, and it's this fake chapel and everything. The other weird thing, of course, is that Jefferson Davis, who is the president of the Confederacy, is the one who bought all the art for the Capitol that nobody ever talks about. Because people snuck in Phrygian slave caps to be abolitionist moves against Jefferson Davis. But anyway, she's in a white communion dress in this painting. And of course, her name is changed to Rebecca. So again, it's the whitening, and as you put it, and then what you see in the hyper-colonialization of it is, where does her figure transform into? It transforms into this Elizabethan figure that's then advertised for tobacco, right? Because her husband, John Rolfe, owns tobacco plantations, and she dies in childbirth sailing back from England to Virginia. But she gets redeployed by him as one of these types of figures. And that's why I kind of want to bring that into your sphere of awareness as well, with this painting that's actually on display, at the heart of the United States government as this piece of Americana. It is about this sort of like whitening of her as well. Because also her name wasn't Pocahontas.
Exactly. And Malinche wasn't Malinche. Malinche was Malitzin, was one of the indigenous names. And then some documents put her down as Mariana. Again.
Naturally.
Right. Then Malitzin. So there's different versions. And eventually Malinche. And the other thing that Octavio Paz left us is the term Malinchista as the traitor, as a word used to refer to a traitor.
So let me ask you a final question here. I feel like I could go for a very long time in this conversation because it's so fascinating. But what is a contemporary reclamation point that you would cite that you think is effective, viable, and hopefully disseminatory?
For
the culture to actually be reflexive of its actuality and history, of any one of the figures you spoke about, or sort of this idea. Obviously, it's not the 2019 La Llorona.
I think, honestly, the Chicana artists and writers are doing amazing work in recovering these figures for us.
So you think it's evolving right now?
It's ever evolving.
Okay.
Ever evolving. Like, I just finished reading a recent book by Gaspar de Alba, fictional, but it talks about the femicides at the Juarez, Texas border. And it's constantly changing and in constant recovery and anti-erasure. And the art that was shown is reclaiming them, but then you also get a blending of both cultures in the new one, but not like Virgen de Guadalupe, which is an imposed blending. I find that the Chicana art is very fluid in how it's blending it. It's very, it is the reality, the lived experience, their feelings in art. And I think that it's ever evolving, and I think if something, it's that artistic production. And now, like, even in fiction and not in fiction, we see this constantly being brought up for re-examination, reconsideration, even acknowledgement that this is happening in the world.
I want to thank you so much. This has been a fantastic talk and conversation. I really appreciate it greatly.
I've had a blast. It's been lovely.
I want to invite everybody to take the survey that Juan is dropping into the various chats right now. I want to invite you also to tune in tomorrow night for Tosha Taylor's talk. And to remind you, as always, stay spooky. I feel like we could have gone on for hours.
I know. I'm just like, oh, and there's this other thing.
That's how I am. I'm just like, yeah, no, it's great because I in terms of Central American stories and things, I mean, I'm not as familiar, I would say. And so to learn more and then to find all these interesting parallels that are transculturating
Yeah,
is
and I
really
think
interesting.
I don't know much about American history, but I've always considered there has to be some sort of parallel narrative with Pocahontas.
I think you find it in this painting.
I'll have to look that up.
And also just this idea of her becoming Rebecca.
And why Rebecca?
Very, very British name in the time. I mean, if you think to the Puritans, Rebecca is a very common name in the New England colonies. So it's very, I say a very Puritan name, not a Catholic name. Can't be Catholic because she's not Catholic. She's becoming Church of England, which is really, really Calvinist at the time.
Yeah.
So I think that's why.
Mary.
Oh, absolutely. Right. Mary becomes, I mean, my favorite Stephen King book is Needful Things.
Oh.
And you get this, the Baptist preacher and the Catholic priest hate each other. And I forget how he words it, but he calls the Virgin Mary a whore.